It was early evening in the Welsh market town of Machynlleth, and the light had already started to fade. Street lamps glowed against the grey sky, and a fine mist sat over the hills that framed the town like a protective wall. All afternoon on the Brynigog estate, you could hear kids playing in the quiet streets. Bikes slid across the wet pavement, a football kept hitting a wall, and somewhere a dog barked, eager to go back inside. Among the children playing that night was a 5-year-old girl whose favorite color was pink. A little girl who had arrived in this world early and fragile, and who had already learned how to fight. Her name was April Sue Lynn Jones. She had been born almost 2 months premature in 2007 and had spent her first weeks inside the humming world of hospital machines and careful hands. Doctors later diagnosed her with mild cerebral palsy, a condition that affected the left side of her body and made walking and balance more difficult. Where other children simply ran, April worked a little harder. She took medication every day and went to regular checkups. Her parents, Coral and Paul, were always watchful, always balancing a desire to let her live freely with the need to keep her safe. Inside the Jones household, however, April did not live like a fragile child. She lived like the sun at the center of a small universe. Her older half-sister, Yasmin, and her brother, Harley, revolved around her. She laughed loudly, demanded cuddles at every opportunity, and insisted on joining in with anything the others did. She loved sparkly things, loved the color pink, loved riding her little bike and feeling, however briefly, like she could keep up with everyone else. To neighbors, she was the happy girl from the estate, always ready with a shy smile that quickly broke into giggles. Machynlleth itself was a town where people's lives overlapped in intricate ways. It sat in a valley surrounded by forested hills and fast-flowing rivers, the sort of landscape that seemed serene until you looked closely at how wild and unforgiving it really was. The community was tight-knit. People recognized each other's cars. Children knew which front doors to knock if they fell off their bikes. The Brynigog estate, with its modest houses and shared play spaces, felt like an extension of the Jones family's living room. April's world was small, but it felt safe. On the 1st of October 2012, a Monday, the Jones family slipped into a routine that felt familiar. April went to her swimming lesson at the local leisure center, another way her parents helped strengthen her weaker leg. Later, there was a parents' evening at school. Her teachers talked about her progress, about how she managed her disability with stubborn determination, about how she lit up the classroom with that smile. When the family arrived home, the sky was darkening and the day should have been winding down. Instead, the evening unfolded into a nightmare that rewrote the lives of everyone on Brynigog and far beyond. After they returned, April asked to go back outside to play. She had already spent much of the day out of the house, but for a 5-year-old with leftover energy, the pull of one more game, one more ride on her bike, was too strong. At first, her parents said no. It was getting late, the light was fading, and they wanted her inside. April, who had never been shy about her feelings, burst into tears and protested. She had a way of fighting for the things she wanted, so Coral and Paul relented with conditions. She could go, but only for a short time, only near the house, only where they knew she would be surrounded by neighbors she had known all her short life. It seemed like such a small compromise. One more game, one more moment of childhood freedom. Then she ran out the door, back into the estate, and disappeared into the soft darkness of that October evening. Long before that night, another life had been drifting in and out of Machynlleth's orbit. Mark Leonard Bridger had been born in Surrey in 1965, the son of a policeman and a housewife. He had grown up in a suburban world far from the Welsh hills. attended school in Croydon, and left with very ordinary exam results. His early adulthood, however, had already shown patterns that would follow him for decades. He picked up a firearms conviction as a teenager, then moved into a long slide of petty criminality: theft, criminal damage, driving offenses, assault. Wherever he went, trouble seemed to follow, and yet he managed to stay just on the far side of disaster. By the time he settled in and around Machynlleth, Bridger was a familiar type to many small communities, the man who always seemed to be starting again. He drifted from job to job, telling different stories about who he was. At various times he claimed to have been a soldier, a heroic rescuer, a man carrying the weight of impossible tragedies. Those stories rarely withstood scrutiny. Friends and partners later described him as a fantasist, someone who lied not simply to hide things, but almost as a way of rewriting his own history. His work history was as unstable as his personal life. He worked in a slaughterhouse, telling people he was comfortable with blood and death. He took shifts as a lifeguard, as a hotel porter, as a mechanic, as a welder. Each job came with a different version of himself, but none lasted long. What did last was a pattern of failed relationships. Bridger fathered 6 children with 4 different women, moved between rented cottages and shared houses, and left a trail of anger, fear, and disappointment in his wake. Some former partners described him as controlling and volatile, someone who could switch from charm to threat with alarming speed. In a town as small as Machynlleth, lives overlapped in ways that were sometimes uncomfortably close. Through relationships and extended family ties, Bridger's children ended up related to April's half-siblings. His name was known to the Jones family. He was not a stranger in an anonymous van. He was one more adult face in the intricate web of family and friendship that tied the town together. People saw his Land Rover rumbling along narrow roads, saw him in pubs, saw him around the estate. To most, he was just another local man with a complicated past. Behind closed doors, however, a darker story was unfolding. On his computer, police would later find hundreds of indecent images of children and files relating to infamous child murders and abductions. He had spent time immersed in stories of vulnerability, violence, and power. On the surface, he lived in a remote cottage called Mount Pleasant, surrounded by hills and forests. Inside that cottage, a fantasy life coexisted with the messy reality of unpaid bills, strained relationships, and unfinished projects. It was a dangerous combination. A man who lied habitually, who had a history of violence, who had a sexual interest in children, living on the edge of a community full of trusting families. While Bridger drifted through this world, April's life followed a very different path. She went to school, learned to read, and learned to navigate her physical limitations with stubborn courage. Her father, Paul, often drove her to hospital appointments and kept track of her medication. Her mother, Coral, hovered between protectiveness and the desire to see her daughter run free. Her sister, Yasmin, was becoming a teenager, full of her own dreams and frustrations, but still fiercely devoted to the little girl who seemed to embody innocence in a town where everyone knew everyone. On the 1st of October 2012, these 2 lives finally intersected in a way that would shatter that sense of safety forever. Around 7:15 that evening, April rode her bike near the estate with a friend. A grey Land Rover Discovery approached, left-hand drive, different enough to stand out in a place where most people recognized each other's vehicles. A child witness would later describe how the driver spoke to April as if he knew her, how his presence did not trigger fear, and how she climbed into the vehicle of her own accord. For a little girl who recognized faces and cars in her small-town world, the man behind the wheel did not feel like a stranger. The vehicle pulled away. The sound of its engine faded. The ordinary noise of children playing filled the space it left behind. When Coral realized she could not see April outside, minutes later, what began as mild concern quickly hardened into panic. She checked the usual places: called her name, asked other children if they had seen her. The answers did not make sense. There had been a car. April had climbed inside. No one had seen her return. At 7:29 p.m., Coral dialed emergency services. In that moment, the disappearance of one little girl became a critical incident that would consume an entire country's attention. Police arrived quickly on Brynigog. They took statements from children who were still shaking with confusion and fear. The description of the vehicle came first, then the blurred image of a man known to some, but not to others. As officers began to canvass the estate, the news spread through Machynlleth like a shockwave. Phones rang, doors opened, and a simple question rippled from house to house. Had anyone seen April? Police launched a major operation that night. They treated the case from the very start as an abduction, not a child who had simply wandered off. Patrol cars swept the local roads. Officers combed the estate, gardens, sheds, and alleys. Helicopters flew overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness that had settled on the valley. Within hours, search and rescue teams, mountain rescue volunteers, and dog handlers were being redirected toward the town. The leisure center became a command hub, a place where officers pinned maps to walls and volunteers queued to offer their help. What began in panic settled into an organized search that grew into the largest operation of its kind in British policing. Over the following days and weeks, officers and volunteers scoured rivers, ravines, woodlands, and disused quarries across an area of roughly 32 square kilometers. They waded through cold, fast-moving water and pushed through dense bracken and forest, calling April's name over and over into an indifferent landscape. The same hills that had made Machynlleth feel sheltered now felt like they were swallowing up the little girl whose pink ribbons appeared everywhere as symbols of hope. While the search expanded, investigators back at the station followed the trail left by that gray Land Rover. In a town where people noticed unfamiliar vehicles, where neighbors looked out for each other, it did not take long for the same name to surface again and again. Within 24 hours of the abduction, police arrested 46-year-old Mark Bridger. His Land Rover matched the description given by the children. He had been seen driving near the estate. He was known to families connected to April's. The fragile web of familiarity that had once made him seem safe now made him the prime suspect. As officers questioned Bridger, search teams continued to scour the valley. At first, hope still existed that April might be alive, hidden somewhere, waiting for rescue. But as hours turned into days, that hope thinned. On the 5th of October, police announced that they were treating the case as a murder investigation. It was a devastating blow to a community that had tied pink ribbons to lamp posts and taped missing posters in every shop window, but the evidence emerging behind the scenes was growing too grim to ignore. The focus shifted to Bridger's rented cottage, Mount Pleasant, on the edge of the nearby village of Shinewes. Nestled among trees and sloping fields, the house looked from the outside like a secluded retreat, far from neighbors' eyes. When officers entered, they found a scene that spoke of panic and haste. The cottage was uncomfortably hot, the result of heating turned up and a fire burning hard in the grate. There was a strong smell of cleaning products. Surfaces and floors showed signs of recent scrubbing. Over the following days, forensic teams carried out a meticulous search of the property. They used special lights, chemical sprays, and microscopic analysis to pick apart the story written into the walls and floors. What they uncovered destroyed any lingering hope that April had simply been hidden away. Small spots and smears on various surfaces tested positive for blood. Under the focus of forensic analysis, they resolved into April's DNA. The pattern and distribution did not match a minor injury. Experts concluded that the child whose blood it was could not have survived the level of bleeding indicated. Near the fireplace, even more disturbing evidence emerged. Tiny bone fragments, calcined and brittle from intense heat. Specialists later identified them as belonging to a young child. The fire that had left the cottage so hot had not merely been for warmth, it had been used to destroy. Meanwhile, digital forensics officers examined Bridger's computer. There they found indecent images of children and material about other child murders and abductions. The man who sat in interview claiming confusion and memory loss had spent time consuming stories and images that centered on the suffering of minors. What happened to April, investigators believed, had been driven by those fantasies. Without a complete body, they could not reconstruct every detail, but a chilling picture formed. A man with a history of violence and lies had taken a vulnerable little girl, assaulted and killed her, then used fire, cleaning, and his knowledge of the local terrain to scatter and conceal what was left. Throughout this period, the search for April's remains continued. Officers and volunteers combed the banks and waters of the nearby River Dulas and the River Dyfi. They searched forests and ravines, bringing in specialist teams to descend into caves and abandoned works. The community refused to abandon hope of bringing her home, even as reality settled in. They wanted a place to grieve, a grave to visit, a sense that she had been found. Days stretched into weeks, and still the landscape kept its secrets. In April 2013, nearly 7 months after April disappeared, the focus of the story shifted from the hills of mid-Wales to a courtroom in Mold. There, before a judge and jury, the quiet town that had stood in front of cameras with pink ribbons and solemn faces now watched its tragedy turned into evidence, testimony, and argument. The prosecution, led by an experienced Queen's Counsel, laid out their case in careful, devastating detail. They described a man who had nurtured violent fantasies for years, who had sought out images and stories of children being abused, and who had moved through life telling lies to shape how others saw him. They argued that on that October evening, he had seized an opportunity when he saw April playing close to the road, using his familiarity to gain her trust and lure her into his vehicle. They presented the forensic evidence from Mount Pleasant, the bloodstains that carried her DNA, the bone fragments burnt in the fireplace, the accelerated heating of the cottage, and the frantic attempts to clean away traces of what had happened. They told the jury about the search operation, about the scale of the effort mobilized to find one small child, and about the cold reality that only fragments of her body had ever been recovered. They placed the indecent images found on his computer side by side with the events of that night, inviting the jury to see the pattern that investigators believed was obvious. This was not a tragic accident, they said. It was the culmination of a long, secret life in which children existed as objects in a fantasy world inside a man's mind. Bridger's defense rested on a very different story. He claimed that he had accidentally run over April with his Land Rover near Brynigog, that he had been drinking, that he had panicked, and that he had no clear memory of what he had done with her body. He denied any sexual motive and painted himself as a man broken by a terrible mistake. In the witness box, he cried, insisted he had not meant to harm her, and suggested that his memory had simply shattered under the weight of shock and alcohol. The jury listened to both versions, but the physical evidence told its own story. There were no signs of an impact on the vehicle that matched his account. There was no reason an accidental death would require burning a body in a fireplace, wiping down surfaces and lying repeatedly to investigators. The presence of child abuse images on his devices, combined with the speed and thoroughness of his attempt to eliminate physical evidence, cut through the narrative of confused panic. The man in the dock had a history of violence and deception. The girl at the center of the case had a history of vulnerability. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. After less than 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with its decision. They found Mark Bridger guilty of abducting and murdering April Jones and of perverting the course of justice by disposing of her body and destroying evidence. He stood in the dock as the judge delivered a sentence that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the pain he had inflicted on April's family by refusing to reveal the truth. The court imposed a life sentence with a whole life order. Bridger would never be released. For Coral and Paul, for Jasmine and Harley, for the extended family and for the people of Machynlleth, the guilty verdict brought a measure of justice, but no real peace. There was relief that the man responsible would never walk free. There was pride in the way the town had come together. But there was also a raw, unfinished grief rooted in the simplest of facts. Most of April's body had never been found. The man who had taken her had chosen to keep the final details to himself, leaving her loved ones trapped in a story that had a verdict but no full ending. Months later, forensic work on the fragments recovered from Mount Pleasant allowed the family to hold a funeral. The tiny coffin that traveled through Machynlleth in a glass carriage did not contain an entire child, only the few pieces science could identify. The town lined the streets, many wearing flashes of pink, the color April had loved so much. Her family walked behind the carriage, carrying a weight no parent should ever have to bear. In the years that followed, the ripples of April's case continued. Her parents and sister campaigned for greater action against online child abuse images and for tougher sentences for those who possessed them. Journalists, politicians, and activists invoked her name in debates about the responsibilities of technology companies, about how the justice system treated sex offenders, and about the limits of public protection. Eventually, the Welsh government bought Bridger's cottage and had it demolished, transforming the place where police believed April had died into a memorial space rather than a monument to his crimes. Inside the Jones family, the consequences went deeper than any political campaign. The strain of living with that loss and with unanswered questions contributed to fractures that never fully healed. Paul later suffered serious health problems and spent his final years in care, carrying with him the knowledge that he never learned what had happened to the rest of his daughter's remains. Yasmin grew up with the trauma of losing her little sister in such a public, brutal way, and spoke about how it had pushed her into self-destructive coping before she slowly turned her pain into a determination to protect other children. For the town of Machynlleth, the case settled like a permanent shadow. People who had trudged through fields and rivers at all hours of the day and night, trying to find one small girl, carried those memories with them. New children grew up playing in streets that had once been filled with search teams and camera crews. Pink ribbons faded, were taken down, wore away, but the story remained part of the town's identity. And at the center of it all remained the image of April Jones, a 5-year-old who had fought her way into the world, who had learned to live with a disability that never defined her, who had loved swimming lessons and bike rides and the color pink. A child who had been allowed one more game outside on a familiar estate, surrounded by neighbors and family in a town that had always felt safe. The case of Mark Bridger was, in legal terms, the story of a man whose lifetime of lies, violence, and hidden desires ended in a whole life sentence. In human terms, it was the story of what happened when that man crossed paths with a little girl who trusted the world around her. It was the story of a community that searched until it could not walk another step, of police who built a murder case without a body, and of a family left with a grief made harsher by the secrets their daughter's killer chose to keep. By the time the courtroom doors closed and reporters moved on to other stories, one truth remained for those who had lived through it. Justice had been done in the narrow sense. But for the people who had loved April, and for the town that had briefly become the focus of the world's attention, the real sentence was a lifetime of remembering a little girl who went out to play one autumn evening and never came home.